Welcome back, everyone. My name's Colin McKibben, lead developer advocate at SailPoint, and in this session, I'm going to be talking about how to make your first API call with SailPoint. So this session is geared more towards beginners to APIs, people who may have never called an API before, or who have limited exposure to invoking APIs. However, for experts of APIs, it might still be worth a listen to this session, especially as I come into the later sections, as I cover some of the more advanced topics of Identity Security Cloud's APIs, including scopes and how to use the Postman collection. So, for the agenda for this session, I'm going to be giving an overview of REST. What is a REST API? What does it do? What does it look like? Then I'm going to be covering authentication, so how you authenticate to our APIs. And then authorization, which is more of an access security control model for APIs. And then finally, I'm going to be doing a deep dive into understanding OpenAPI specifications, which is the documentation that you'll read to learn how to make API calls on our platform. So REST stands for Representational State Transfer, but it's basically a fancy way of saying sending data over the internet. Rather than creating an entirely new protocol, REST reuses many of the same protocols and conventions as the HTTP protocol. So it uses a lot of the same status codes, a lot of the same verbs. So they look very similar. It's just that REST defines more of a structure in the data that you're sending and receiving. So in REST, URLs represent endpoints. Endpoints are the type of resource or a resource that you're trying to interact with. Maybe it's to create a new object in a database or get a list of objects. So if we look at a URL for a REST API, you'll see that there's the host name that begins the URL. The host name is typically the name of the company that's providing the REST API. It may have some other subdomains in there. So in the case of SailPoint, we have the .api.identitynow.com. It's different than just going straight to identitynow.com. Next, after the hostname, you'll see a base path. This is a static piece of URL that doesn't really change between different endpoints, and it's usually an indication of maybe a certain collection or a version of the API that you're working with. Usually after a base path, you'll have a collection identifier. So this would be, in this case, like sources, access profiles, roles. Collections are really just a name given to a collection of similar objects that you're going to be interacting with. And finally, after the collection, typically what you'll see is a resource identifier, which identifies a single object within that collection. Now in REST APIs, there can be collection hierarchies. So what you can see is multiple collections divided by individual resources. And the best way to think about this is like a music folder on your computer. So in your music folder, you might have a bunch of folders for different artists. That would be like your collections. And within each artist folder, you might have albums. So that could be another sub-collection. And then at the end of the album, if you click into an album, what you'll see is a bunch of MP3 files or whatever audio format you use for the individual songs. And those files would be your resources, the individual things that you're trying to interact with. In REST, it's kind of the same thing. The URL can have multiple collections and sub-collections. So if we look at the sources API for SailPoint, you can see that the first collection, the parent collection, is the sources collection. Then it's divided by an individual resource, an individual source. So that's that big long string of characters that's identifying an individual source. Then that source has another collection underneath it for provisioning policies, because one source can have multiple provisioning policies. And finally, at the very end, we have another resource identifier, and that's the create string that you see there, and that's just identifying an individual provisioning policy on that source. So to identify resources, typically REST APIs will use long UIDs or unique identifiers to identify a resource. You won't usually see human-readable names in REST APIs to identify resources. And that's just because UIDs are much easier to work with for computers. They're more globally unique. There's less of a chance of name collisions. And especially when URLs, you can't have a resource that's named the same within the same collection. So typically you're going to see a big long string of characters, and that's going to identify an individual resource that you're trying to interact with. REST typically uses JSON as the language for sending and receiving data. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and REST APIs can accept many different types of data formats, but JSON is the most common. And if you look at a lot of different languages like TypeScript or really any of the web browser-based languages, JSON is a natively supported object model for those languages, and that's why JSON is such a popular format of data for REST. Now in JSON, it's very simple. There's only a few different data types that you'll be interacting with. There is strings, so that's like text, like names or descriptions. There's numbers, so like a count of objects or a number of errors you might see in your data model. There's booleans, that's true or false values. And then there's objects and arrays. So JSON object, that's that big parent object you see. So you see those curly braces, that denotes an object in JSON. JSON objects can have nested objects. So if we look at the example on this presentation, you'll see that the manager is actually another object, and manager has a type, ID, and name. And then the final type of data that JSON supports is arrays. So arrays are lists of any of the JSON types that I have already mentioned. So arrays could be a list of strings, of numbers, of booleans, of objects, and it can even be arrays of arrays. And so our example on the left here, you'll see that attributes is an array. You can tell it's an array because it uses square brackets instead of curly braces. And attributes is actually an array of objects. Now earlier I was talking about how REST uses a lot of the same conventions as HTTP. It borrows a lot from it. And so when we're talking about how we interact with an individual endpoint in REST, really it's using the same verbs that you would see in an HTTP protocol. So for example, to create a new resource or execute an action on a collection, you would use the post verb. This is one of the common HTTP verbs that you may come across if you're a web developer. If you want to get one or more resources, you use the get verb. If you want to update a resource in its entirety, typically REST APIs will implement the put verb for that update command. If you want to partially update a resource, say maybe only update a description or a name, patch is a newer HTTP verb that allows you to update individual portions of a resource. And then finally, if you want to delete a resource, you'll use the delete verb. REST relies on HTTP headers in order to send more metadata about the request and the response. So some common headers that you might send with your request when you're calling an API include the authorization header. This is a very common header for REST APIs. Authorization will contain a bearer token, an API key, some way to authenticate you to that REST service so that it will give you the data you're asking for. There's also the content type header. This is where you can control or ask the server what type of data you want to send it. Typically, it's going to be JSON by default, but some REST APIs may accept other data formats like XML or CSV. And then there's the accept header. So you can tell the server what data format you want to receive in return. Again, JSON is usually the default, but some REST APIs will implement other data formats like XML, and you could say, I want to receive my data in XML format. Headers can be used to control how data is sent to and processed by the server. So it depends on the REST API that you're working with, but you may have the ability to tell the server that you want to zip or compress the data before you send it out and when you receive it. That way you're using less bandwidth to get that data back. And again, you may also tell it via the accept header what kind of data you want to receive back, whether that's like text or CSV or XML. And headers can also be used to learn more about the response data so that you can take additional steps later. So a REST API may return certain response headers like account. So SailPoint APIs, if you specify a certain query parameter in the response, you'll get a count header back that will tell you how many items were returned in that response, which can be a convenient way to learn how many items are in that response as opposed to having to iterate over the collection to count them yourself. In other cases, response headers could be a form of telling you when an API is deprecated. So there could be a deprecated header being returned that tells you, hey, that API is deprecated, you should no longer use it, there is a newer version. Go back one more. So after headers, there's query parameters. Query parameters are another way to control how data is sent and received to an API server, but directly in the URL as opposed to headers. So query parameters are the very last thing in a URL. So after you've defined your path, where you're identifying a particular resource via the resource ID, you'll use a question mark to say that this is the start of my query parameters. Now, query parameters are very independent or dependent on what the API server is implementing. So it's not the same for every API that you may be interacting with. So SailPoint has a standard set of query parameters that almost all of our endpoints use, but each endpoint may also implement their own specialized query parameters just for that endpoint. So it's always important to read the API specification to figure out what query parameters are available for that endpoint. So if we look at the anatomy of a query parameter, again, it starts with a question mark that tells the server that this is the start of my query parameters. Then it's followed by one or more key value pairs for each query parameter you want to implement on that request. So in this example, for the access request status API, the query parameters are requested for equals me. So that's going to say I only want to see access requests that were requested for me, not anyone else. And then there's an ampersand there. Ampersands are used to combine two or more query parameters. So the next query parameter is, not only do I just want to see requests by me, I also want them to be sorted by the created date. And again, you can have almost as many of these query parameters as you want in an individual request. It's just up to how you want to return that data. So REST uses a lot of the same response codes from the HTTP protocol. There's 3 different classifications of response codes. So if you submit a request to an API and it's a successful request, you'll get something in the 200 range. So a generic successful request might be a 200. Typically you'll see that if you're trying to get data, the server will return a 200 response code. And that's just a quick and easy way for the server to tell you, hey, this was successful. Check the response body. There's probably going to be data in there. Some other common response codes for success are 201. Typically, you'll see that when you're creating a resource using a post verb. And then 204, no response data. That just is what you're going to see typically when you delete a resource and there's no data to return because you deleted that resource. The next classification of response codes are the client error classification. So the 400 range of response codes indicate a client error. Usually that's something that you specified in your request that is either invalid or the server doesn't recognize it. And it's something that you can fix as a client. So what you might see is a 400 bad request. That's just a very generic client error. Typically with that, you're going to see an error message in the response that will indicate more clearly what the issue was, so you can go and resolve that yourself. Some other common ones are the 401 unauthorized. So if you provide an invalid token or an expired token, typically you'll see a 401 unauthorized. And then another common one is a 404 not found. You may have visited a web page where that no longer exists, and the web page returns a 404 on the page. That just means that the resource you're trying to access doesn't exist, so it's going to give you a 404. And that final classification of response codes are the server errors. That's going to be your 500 range. Server errors mean the server was unable to process the request for some reason, and it's not typically something that you can fix yourself. These 500 errors are something that's going on with the backend, and it's something that the backend service team will probably have to fix themselves, but you should probably notify them if you're getting some kind of 500. Again, a 500 error is just a general server error. There may be something in the response body that's telling you more specifically what's going on. But another common one you might experience is a 503 service unavailable. That just means that the service you're trying to access is down. Maybe a server was taken offline. Nothing you can really do about that. You just have to wait until the server is back online. All right, next we'll talk about authentication, which is how you obtain a secure token that allows you to access an API. So the authentication process for most REST APIs are to first create an API key or credentials that allow you to generate tokens or just in general authenticate with an API. These credentials are typically long-lived. Again, they're meant to be for you to create access tokens, which are shorter-lived, so that you can authenticate. But once you have your API key or credentials, the next thing to do is usually request an access token. Typically, there's a specialized endpoint or URL that you're going to invoke with your API credentials that will give you an access token that's shorter-lived that you will actually use to authenticate your requests. And then finally, the last step is use that access token to authenticate your requests. And typically, you're going to put that in the authorization header for every API call that you make. So let's go into our first demonstration. So the first thing I'm going to show is how to generate a personal access token for Identity Security Cloud. So any user can create a PAT or a personal access token. You don't have to be an admin, but the user level that you are in Identity Security Cloud does determine how much access you have to our APIs. So to generate a PAT, I log into my Identity Now tenant. I click on my name in the top right. I go to Preferences. And then on the left, there is a tab for personal access tokens. Every user can have up to 10 personal access tokens for different use cases. You can support different scripts or Postman testing, but you can have up to 10. Now to create a new token, I just click the New Token button. Give it a description so I know what it's being used for, so I can manage it later on. There is a section to fill out scopes. I'm actually going to talk about scopes in the authorization section later on. So for now, I'm just going to give it a default scope. And I will click Create. Then you'll be presented with the client ID and secret. So the client ID is not really a secret. It's just an identifier for your personal access token. However, it's always good to just keep that as hidden as possible, but if it is leaked, it's not the end of the world. However, the secret is a secret. You definitely want to store that someplace secure, and you don't want to share that with anyone. So what you'll do is you'll copy these both out, store them somewhere secure so you can use it later, and then you're good to go. Now, once you click out of that screen, the secret will never be presented to you again. So if you lose the secret, you can't get that back. You'll just have to generate a new personal access token. Okay, so that was a demonstration on creating a personal access token. So next, let's talk about OAuth 2. So OAuth 2 is a standardized form of authenticating with APIs. Not every API will use OAuth 2, but it is a very common one, and SailPoint does use OAuth 2 to authenticate. So in OAuth 2, again, it's a standard, and there's 3 main grant types that SailPoint supports. And a grant type is really just determining how that token is generated and how it can be used. Now, the authorization code grant type is typically used for web applications where you're allowing a web application to act on behalf of a user. If you've ever used, like an iPhone app for like Dropbox, typically that app would use something like an authorization code grant type. So you would log into the app, and that app can then perform API calls on your Dropbox account as you. And so that's kind of an example of what an authorization code grant type is. There's the refresh token grant type. This is a type of grant type that allows a web app, like the one I just described, to refresh your access token, which again are short-lived, so you don't have to log in as frequently. So if you think again about like a Dropbox app, usually you log in once and you don't have to log in again for days, weeks. That's because of the refresh token. That application will be using the refresh token to automatically refresh that token in the background, so you don't have to log in as many times. And then finally, there's the client credentials grant type. So this grant type is used to generate an access token outside of the context of a user. There's not really a user associated with it. And typically this is used for scripts or applications that need to operate in the background, not as any particular user. And that's the three main grant types that SailPoint supports. So I'll go into my next demonstration, how to actually create OAuth 2 credentials in SailPoint. So back to my screen, I'm going to go to the admin console. Only admins can generate OAuth 2 credentials in an Identity Now tenant. I will navigate to Global, Security Settings, and API Management. So this is where you'll find the table of all of the OAuth 2 credentials that your tenant has created. So to create a new one, you just click New, give it a description again. You'll see the three different grant types that I just talked about. So again, if you're going to build like a web application where you're invoking API calls on behalf of a user, you would use the authorization code. So if I select that, you see there's additional information being asked for. It's asking for a redirect URL. This is typically, if you're running a web app server, this would be the server URL of that web app. That way, the web app can get the token back. If I click on refresh token, you can specify how long the refresh token should be good for. So if you want people to log in every month on your web app, you would select 1 month. But if you want there to be a longer period of time, say 2 years in between having a user log in, you can go all the way up to 2 years. And then there's the client credentials grant type. Now, an individual OAuth credential can have all three grant types, and that means you can generate tokens for that OAuth credential using all three different methods. But typically, you would either use authorization code and refresh token, or you would use client credentials separately. And once again, you'll specify scopes for that OAuth credential. Again, I'll talk about scopes a little later on, but I'll just select a default scope here. Create that. There we go. Same thing, you're gonna get a client ID and a client secret. Keep those somewhere safe and secure because you'll need those to authenticate. The last thing I need to do is just clean this up. There we go, just one. Delete that. Okay. So that is a demonstration on how to create OAuth credentials. And next we'll discuss authorization. So what's the difference between authentication and authorization? Well, authentication is verifying that you are who you say you are, whereas authorization is verifying that you are allowed to access a certain thing. So another way to think about that is like a security badge for scanning into your building, your company's building. So the badge authenticates you. It says who you are, so that people know who you are. Whereas authorization would be the level of access to the different rooms you have in that building. So if you scan your key badge on a particular room and it allows you to go in, that means you're authorized to access that room. But if it denies you, you're not authorized to access that room. So when combined, authentication and authorization make a very powerful security model for APIs. So on to scopes. So we looked at scopes in the PAT and the OAuth credentials demos. So what are scopes? Well, scopes are fine-grained access controls that specify what particular endpoints an API token is allowed to access. Scopes give you very fine-grained control over, again, the access rights of that token, so that if you have a script that's really just doing a particular function and it doesn't need to be able to do a lot of different things on the platform, you want to use that particular scope so you lock down the access of that script. Scopes are a security feature, again, that limit the breadth of access a token has. This can prevent legitimate users, like developers on your team, from accidentally accessing or modifying data they never intended to access. If you prevent their token from even touching it in the first place, they can't accidentally touch it. But it can also limit the attack vector of a compromised token. So if your token were ever to be compromised by an attacker and it has a strict set of scopes on it, the amount of things that attacker can do with that API token are much, much reduced. Yeah, so if we look at an example of how to apply scopes to different use case and scenarios, we look at this image here. So token 1, the green token, is for an admin who needs to manage all aspects of access requests. So this token needs to access the following scopes, the create, the cancel, and the read scopes for access requests. Token 2, however, is for an application that only needs to submit access requests on behalf of others, so it doesn't need to do anything else. And so in that case, it really only needs the create access request scope. The next form of authorization at SailPoint is user levels. So scopes are very fine-grained access controls that an API can be limited to. User levels, however, are a broader range of access that a user can have. So every user in a SailPoint tenant must have a user level. At the bare minimum, there'll be a user, and users have the least amount of privilege to access things on the site. It can be all the way up to admins. So admins have the ability to access almost anything in the APIs. So it's always important to make sure that the users that are generating APIs are assigned the appropriate user level for their function, because that's the first layer of defense. It will put a ring around what they're able to access in the first place. Now, once you have a user level set, the next level of security is applying scopes to every individual token that user generates to further refine what their tokens can even access. Okay, so next demonstration, I'm going to show you how to set a user level and scopes. So back to my screen, I'm going to take a look at one of my identities. And if I click on that identity, you can see that there's a user levels icon here. Right now it's not set to anything. So if I edit that user level, if it's not set to anything, the default again is user, which is very limited privilege. But if I click on the button here, you can see all the different user levels that are available in SailPoint. Again, admin's the most powerful. It has access to the most things. And it kind of goes down the list here of more strict controls over what you're allowed to access. So for example, if Aaron Nichols, he just needs to be a source admin, he only needs to manage his sources, he doesn't really need any other privilege, I'd give him the source admin privilege. There we go. He has that user level assigned, so that automatically restricts what he's allowed to access in the API. Now to set a scope, let's say I need to generate a new token, a new personal access token. I can go in here, click new token, and then for the scopes, you'll see all the different scopes that are available in SailPoint. Now there's a lot of them here. The description is usually pretty descriptive on what that scope grants access to. But if you're unsure, another way that I'm going to show you how to understand what scopes you need is to look at the API specification, because every endpoint will tell you what scope it needs in order to be accessed. Now, two important scopes are the default scope and the scopes all. So the default scope is the minimum amount of privilege that you can grant to a user or a token. This scope only grants access to APIs that require no authorization at all. So giving people this scope typically means that user is not, or that token is not going to be able to access really any of the APIs. There's only a few APIs that don't require any authorization. So that's the minimum amount of privilege. Now, you can mix and match scopes. So you could say, I need this person to manage CAM admin, maybe also access requests. I'll put a few on here. Then we can create that. So you can mix and match scopes. Every scope that you add further increases the level of access that token has. So you can see here, as I hover over it, there's 3 different scopes applied. At any time, you can modify a personal access token and change the scopes. So the next time that token creates a new bearer token, it will be with the new scopes. So I can disable scopes, I can add scopes, but the last scope that is interesting is the SP scopes all. So this is a shortcut to basically grant all rights associated with the user's user level. So again, if you're an admin and you give that token SP scopes all, that token can access just about any API in SailPoint. Now, if you're a source admin and you give that token SP scopes all, that API or that token can manage or interact with any API that a source admin is allowed to interact with. So that's just a shortcut to just give the user level everything that their user level allows them to. All right, next up, I'm going to show you how to read OpenAPI documentation. So back to my screen, the OpenAPI documentation for SailPoint is located on developer.sailpoint.com. If we hover over the documentation, we have IIQ and Identity Security Cloud. Both of them have their own set of API specs and they look the same. So we'll look at Identity Security Cloud. API specifications is the first thing under there. There's API specs for NERM and again for Identity Security Cloud. So I'll click on Identity Security Cloud. And on the left-hand side here, you'll see some helpful information about the APIs. So there's a Getting Started guide. This will walk you through how to make your first API call as quickly as possible. There's a detailed authentication guide, which covers all of the authentication models that I've already discussed. Again, there's another detailed authorization guide that talks about scopes and user levels and how to apply them. There's the standard collection parameters. So these are going to be query parameters that are common across many of our APIs. There's a little section on rate limiting, so how many API calls you can make in a given time frame before we rate limit you and ask you to slow down. There's a guide on patch requests. So remember, patch is for updating a particular resource. Patch can be confusing, especially for first-time users and veterans alike. So we have a dedicated patch guide that explains a lot of the nuances of how to make a patch request. And then finally, we have the different versions of the ISC APIs. There's the beta collection. So this is a collection of APIs that are under development. They may change with short notice, but we're giving that as a preview to users so they can provide feedback. The V3 APIs are the production APIs, and they're the ones that you should use before you go to beta. So if I expand the V3 APIs, you can see all the different collections listed on the left here. So we have our access profiles, accounts, certification campaigns. Really, a lot of the things that you see in the user interface usually have an API collection underneath that powers that UI component. If I click on access profiles, here are all the individual endpoints for that collection. So what you'll notice here on the left is there's a get, post, patch, delete. Those are the HTTP verbs, the actions that you can perform on a given resource. So for example, get, the summary here says list access profiles. So this endpoint will allow you to list out all of your access profiles. If you need to update an access profile, you can see by the summary that this will allow you to update one, and delete, again, it's the same thing. The summary kind of just tells you what this endpoint does. Now, if I click on one, for example, the list access profiles, here is the OpenAPI specification in a human-readable format. At the top, you'll see the base path, host name, and full URL of that endpoint. So since this is listing access profiles, you won't provide an individual resource ID. You're just going to provide the collection, and that will allow you to list out all of the access profiles. So that's the full URL that you'll use to invoke this endpoint. If we scroll down a little bit, there's usually a description about each endpoint. This will contain more contextual information about that endpoint, maybe some nuances about it that aren't similar across other APIs. For example, list access profiles, we indicate that you need a token with one of these user levels in order to call this API. Next up, we have the request parameters. So this is a GET endpoint, so we do list out the different query parameters that you can use to control how the data is being sent back to you. So for example, I could specify, let's see here, a limit and an offset to paginate over all the records. So access profiles, looks like it has a limit of 50 access profiles per request. So you can get up to 50 access profiles per API call. So if you want to paginate and get the next 50, you'll use the limit and offset query parameters. Some other common ones you'll see on list endpoints are filters. So filters are a way to filter the data that's being returned. For example, if you only want to access profiles with a name that starts with Active Directory, you could use this filter query parameter to just return those access profiles. That way you don't have to return everything and loop through all the different pages. So that's the query parameters section. Down at the bottom, we have our documentation for the responses. So you'll see the different response codes that this endpoint could return. So if it's successful, it will return a 200. If it's a client error, it could return a 400, a 401. There's a few other in here, like a 429 for a rate limit. And then there's the 500 error. So these are the different responses that you could expect back from the API. Now if I click on the 200, we'll see here that there is a schema that defines the data that's going to be returned back to you. So a schema is really just a representation telling you what to expect back. So in this case, for access profiles, you can expect an array of access profiles where each item in the array will have an ID, a name, a description, etc. Other information you'll see is if the field is required or not, if it can be null or not, and that just helps you handle use cases or edge cases based on the data that's being returned. So nullable means that description may be null. There may not be a description for that access profile, so you should handle that accordingly in your code. And then there's always an example schema. So if I click on the example, this is a more of an example of the type of data that you could expect back as a response. It's an easier way to see, again, what you can expect back so you can develop your applications off of that code. If I scroll back to the top, in the top right, there's an authorization. It's kind of tricky. It doesn't indicate that you can click this, but if you click the authorization, it expands, and it tells you more about how to authorize with this endpoint. So for example, this one says you need a user context auth. That means you need a personal access token in order to access this endpoint. You can't use client credentials. And that's actually a common form of errors that people have is they try to use client credentials with these APIs, but they're requiring a user context, aka a personal access token. The next important thing you'll see is the scopes. So again, every endpoint is going to list out these scopes that it needs in order for you to access it. And so this is a way to help you understand what scopes you need to apply to your personal access token in order to use this endpoint. And the last convenient feature is sample code. So if you're a Python developer, every endpoint will actually have a sample request in Python already baked into the website. So theoretically, you can copy this, substitute some of your values like your tenant name instead of this generic sale point, and this should be working Python code. And it supports many different languages. Go is one. There's a Node, Ruby, a lot of different languages depending on what kind of developer you are. The next one I'll show you is a post request. So this is to create a resource. It's slightly different. Again, a lot of the information will be the same. For example, we'll have this contextual description. There's the authorization model. But what's going to be different is you'll see a request body instead of query parameters. You might also see query parameters, but you're definitely going to see a body usually. And the body is a description of the data that you need to send in your request to the server in order for this to be successful. So again, the body, it's telling you what items you need to include. So if it's required, you absolutely need to include a name. But if it's not required, you don't have to include it. So you could leave a description out if you wanted to. If I scroll down a little bit, again, it's going to look very similar. We have a response model, response object that you can expect back as a response from a successful request. But if I look over to the right, post request that require a request body will also have an example request object. So this is an example of a body that you could provide in your API call in order to create an access profile. It's just a nice, convenient way to see, again, what data you need to pass in for this to be successful. So that is a quick tutorial on how to read OpenAPI specifications. The next demonstration is going to be on how to download and use the SailPoint Postman collection. So if you like the convenience of an HTTP client like Postman for exploring and testing APIs, we do provide Postman collections for all of our different versions. So again, under the API specifications for Identity Security Cloud, if you click the Postman collections on the sidebar, it will give you, right off the top here, convenient buttons for downloading and running each different version in your Postman environment. So if I take a look here, if I look at my Postman, I have a v3 right now. What I'm going to do is delete my v3 collection. So let's say I'm starting from scratch. I want to import the v3 API collection. I'll click this Run in Postman. It will ask me to fork the collection into my workspace. Okay, and then just confirming that this is how I want it to show up, what the label for my collection will be and which workspace I want it to fork to. And if that all looks good, I'll click Fork. And there we go. So it definitely forked to my web browser version of Postman, but if I go to my desktop client, it also appeared right back there. So again, quick and easy way to get the entire collection of APIs from SailPoint that are always up to date with the latest API changes. Now to set this up, the Postman guide, Postman collection guide in our developer portal, if you scroll down, it will tell you different information like how to update your collections, so how to get the latest APIs into your current collection, as well as how to configure your environment. So if simply forking it isn't enough to make API calls, you actually have to do some additional setup. For example, one of the things you have to do, which is again described in the guide, is set up a new environment for your personal access token, client ID, and secret. So I'm not going to show how to do that because that will show some of my tokens. I already have one set up. My SailPoint environment has my tenant name, my client ID, and my client secret, which are the three things you need in order to make API calls with our collection. And once that's set up, all I have to do is go into here. Again, you'll see all the collections are there. If I want to get an access profile, I can click on that endpoint. The URL is already filled out. The base URL will be calculated based on your environment settings. All the query parameters that are available for that endpoint will show up in the Params tab. And you can enable them if you want just by selecting it and putting in an appropriate value. And you don't need to mess with authorization because that's already handled. So I'm going to go ahead and click Send. Okay. And again, because my environment's already set up, it was a successful request. I got my data back. And so quick and easy. That's how you start invoking SailPoint APIs. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. So hopefully you learned something new about APIs if you're a veteran, something new about SailPoint's APIs. But if you're a beginner, I hope you were able to take away with more understanding of how APIs work, how to read them, and how to make your first API call. But if you have any issues or you want to learn more, head on over to the developer community, and I'll be there as well as many of our ambassadors and other great community members to help you with on your journey to making API calls. Thank you.